Well, all right. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of justice. When I reviewed the David Platt speech at the T4G conference, he decides to preach on the passage from Amos where he says, "Let justice roll down like waters." And he actually does a really good job exegeting that passage, but unfortunately, he doesn't choose to define justice. And I think that's kind of where he goes off the rails in the speech or sermon. I never know whether to call it a speech or a sermon, but it seems like it's more like a speech. Anyway, in the speech, he starts to cite what he considers examples of injustice. And some of the things that he says are these income and wealth disparities. And he also talks about a few other disparities as well. And so he says, well, look, the average white family makes income up here, but the average black family has an income down here. And the same thing with wealth, and the same thing with jobs and stuff like that. And he says that's an example of injustice, and he's trying to connect that with what Amos was talking about when he said, "Let justice roll down like waters." And unfortunately, that's where he goes off the rails. That is not an example of injustice. When you cite an income disparity like that, it could be an example of injustice, but you have to prove it. The income disparity itself does not prove it, unless you're using cultural Marxist type categories. Now, here's where I like to go in the Bible to kind of make this point. The first place I like to go is in Matthew chapter 20. This is a parable that a lot of us really have a lot of familiarity with. This is the parable Jesus tells where there's a landowner and he wants some people to work his field. And so he goes to the marketplace and he finds some people. And he goes at different times in the day. He goes in the morning and he sends some workers to the field. He goes about midday, and then he goes towards the evening and he finds workers each time. And at the end of the day, he pays everybody exactly the same amount. He pays each person a denarius. And this makes the people that were hired at the beginning of the day kind of upset, because if you divide that denarius hourly, they made much less per hour than the people that were hired in the midday and towards the end of the day. And so there's an income disparity here with this particular job. And they grumble at him, and they're upset. And this is what the owner says of the land. He said, this is in Jesus' parable, verse 13. He says, "He replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me?'" Now, we know that this is not primarily a parable about economics. However, if the economics of this parable are untrue, and the owner of the vineyard is not allowed to do with his money as he pleases, then the application that Jesus is trying to make is also untrue. And so we have to embrace the economic situation that he is presenting here in order to understand and embrace the actual message that he's trying to tell about the kingdom of God. And so what do we have here? We have evidence of an income disparity, a very clear income disparity, because the workers at the beginning of the day were making much less per hour than the workers at the end of the day who were making much more per hour. They all got the same at the end, but hourly, there's an income disparity. There's no question about that. That's why the people were grumbling. Now, was this owner unjust? Jesus says no. He was not unjust. And so that proves it. What it does prove, it doesn't prove everything, but what it does prove is that an income disparity in itself is not an injustice, because we don't want to accuse Jesus of any kind of an injustice. We don't want to accuse Jesus of saying something is totally fair. We don't want to say, well, yeah, Jesus, you weren't quite right. That actually isn't fair. No, it is fair. If you agree to work for a certain amount, even if it's less than white people as a whole earn for a certain job, that's not an injustice. It just simply isn't. You have to actually show how something is an injustice. Now, the Bible has a lot of warnings for rich people. There's no question about that. And the Bible has a lot of comfort for poor people. But we have to understand that this is a very specific kind of warning, a very specific kind of comfort that the Bible is offering for rich and for poor. Here's James chapter 5, right? James chapter 5 contains a warning to the rich. And James is saying, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." Now, he's not saying that they have to weep because they're rich. He's not saying that they're going to have miseries come upon them because they're rich. Here's what he's saying. Verse 4. He says, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." So what is happening here is these people aren't just rich, and because they're rich and they have a higher income, they have some sort of rich privilege, and so we have to repent of our rich privilege. That's not the issue. The issue is they defrauded people that were working for them. So that's the sin that breaks the commandment, "You shall not steal." They are stealing from people that work for them. And the reason they're doing it is because they're rich and they have much more power. And so they're like, what are you going to do about it? You're going to take me to court? I've got better lawyers than you. I can buy influence on that court. What are you going to do about it? I'm not going to pay you. That's the problem. It's not that they're rich. It's not that they have a higher income or wealth. And that's not because there's a disparity there. No, it's because they're committing fraud. And so David Platt, if he wants to actually have an effect on somebody like me who's going to go to the scriptures and say, okay, let justice roll down like waters, yes, so let's find out what that injustice is, he can't just cite an income disparity. He has to show how the current income disparities that exist are due to fraud or due to something like that. And it can't just be a historical generations and generations ago kind of fraud. It has to be a fraud right now that we can actually adjudicate, we can actually correct according to biblical standards of justice. 2 or more witnesses, all of that. And so that's the thing. So when James talks about the rich and he says, woe to the rich, he's saying, no, woe to the rich who got rich by fraud, by abusing their power. Now, the other thing is, a lot of people in this movement tend to, look at poor people as if that they're just always victims, and that's why they're poor. That's a Marxist analysis of the situation. So you look at the disparity, you say, okay, the blacks are only earning this much, the Hispanics are only earning this much, but the whites are earning this much. Therefore, these people down here, they're victims. That's not what the Bible teaches. Look at Proverbs chapter 10, right? Proverbs chapter 10. Here's what it says in verse 4. "Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth." Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Now, this is not saying that every poor person is lazy. This is not saying that every rich person has diligent hands, because there are lazy rich people as well, and there are also hardworking poor people. This is talking about specific poor people who are lazy, who do have a sinful attitude when it comes to work, when it comes to managing money, when it comes to all of these things. There can be such a thing as a poor person who's poor for a reason. And it has nothing to do with being a victim. They could just be a victim of their own laziness. And so this is why we have to have nuance. This is why we can't adopt Karl Marx as our standard of justice, because Karl Marx says, if you're making less than this other group up here who's making more, then you are a victim. And Jesus says, no. No, you might be a victim, but we have to prove that. We have to prove that you were defrauded, or you have to prove that there was some kind of crime done against you. But it could be that you're just poor because you're lazy. Or it could be that there are other circumstances, like, you could be a hard worker, but outside circumstances could come and make you poor. I'm a hard worker, but, don't get me wrong. In an instant, I could have a catastrophic medical problem, and I could be poor in an instant. Okay, and it has nothing to do with my laziness. It's nothing to do, you see what I'm saying? So this could happen. I'm not saying that it doesn't. It's always one way or the other. But the reality is, this is why we cannot just say there's the disparity, there's the injustice, Karl Marx style. No, we have to go to the scriptures and define these things according to scriptural terms. And it's the same with incarceration rates. It's the same with all of this stuff. We can't just assume victimhood. Because that's a Marxist interpretation of the situation, not a biblical interpretation. So I hope this was helpful. I plan to do a few more of these videos to sort of kind of hash out what the basics of biblical justice are. This is a topic that is very deep in the Bible. If you haven't discovered how the scriptures speak to justice specifically in very specific terms and economics and things like that, I suggest you do that study. It is absolutely fascinating, and it makes it very easy to see when people are misusing the term, like David Platt did, unfortunately, in his T4G speech. God bless. I hope this was helpful.